We're trying to find out the secret of happy couples,
Yes.
highly happy couples. What actually causes unhappiness? And there's all these usual suspects. I mean, you speak at enough marriage conferences, you hear from people, and people tend to think, and the usual suspects are like money, conflict, different parenting philosophies, in-laws have become outlaws. So since I've got the expert on happiness right here in front of me, what is the leading cause of unhappiness in marriage?
None of the above.
Have you ever found yourself disappointed with your spouse because they're just not living up to your expectations? You might think, if they love me, they would actually want to keep the house the way that I want to keep the house. They would want to go out more. They would want to do what I want to do. Today, we're going to find out, why is it that highly happy couples put their expectations under the microscope a lot more than their spouse? All right, we're on this season 4 where we're talking about these secrets from highly happy couples.
Very fun.
That has been fun. And it's been fun is that they're actually pretty simple. Like when I think about a lot of these, whether they're just simple mindset shifts or whether they are just simple little practical things to do, I've been happy myself about how I can apply these immediately.
Yes, so practical.
Yeah,
so simple.
So simple. So thank you so much for all the research that you've done on this.
It was a fun one.
Made it super accessible for us. Again, if you haven't gotten the book, it's a short book, The Surprising Secrets of Highly Happy Marriages. Pick it up anywhere that you get books. But it begs the question, okay, we're trying to find out the secret of happy couples,
Yes.
highly happy couples. What actually causes unhappiness? And there's all these usual suspects. I mean, you speak at enough marriage conferences, you hear from people, and people tend to think, and the usual suspects are like money, conflict, different parenting philosophies, in-laws have become outlaws. So since I've got the expert on happiness right here in front of me, what is the leading cause of unhappiness in marriage?
None of the above.
None of them.
It's what causes those problems, which is unmet expectations. You have... This is a very common neuroscience principle. It's a common psychological principle where you have a certain expectation about your spouse, about whatever it is, and you just think that this is the way it should be, in air quotes,
right.
Should, and that's not something that is being met.
Yep. Equals
unhappiness. If we're not careful, that's what happens.
It's so true. We talk about in the Weekend Remember often with couples, the conference that FamilyLife does, is that I like to give this illustration. Those of you that are on YouTube, you'll actually be able to watch this. So if you're listening to it, you might want to go watch the YouTube channel on this. You'll see it. But we like to use this illustration with arms, Shaunti. You can do it with me if you want to.
Okay.
It's like the bottom arm represents reality. The top arm represents expectations. And what happens in marriage and in life, really, this principle that you're talking about, is the farther that expectations get from reality, what's in between that gap is disappointment.
There's a giant gap there for some people.
That's right.
Yes, exactly.
And so the goal of any pursuit in life, whether it's work or relationships, is how do I get expectations to match reality? And that's really what the secret's all about, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. The key here, and this is the most important thing, we call this chapter something that people are like, come again? Because the title of the chapter is Highly Happy Couples Have Factual Fantasies. Right?
Wait, that doesn't go. That's an oxymoron, isn't it? From what I remember from English.
And it's like, what? I know our producer Bruce was like, yeah, those two things don't work together. And so here's really the way that this works. Is that the key is that all of us have the tendency to have certain expectations of our spouse that they are just not wired to meet. And expecting that is going to cause us pain. Let me give you an example of this. So this is a very, very common thing, and I'll just use amongst women. There's others that men have. But for example, any woman who has ever watched a romance movie, a rom-com, any woman who's ever read a novel that has any kind of romance element or has, whatever, listened to songs or whatever, it is very easy in our minds to subconsciously expect that when we have been having a really bad argument with our spouse and we pull away and, we're crying and there's something in us that expects and wants our spouse to come after us.
Right.
Because that's the plot of the romance novels, right? We don't realize that that's kind of the plot of every romance novel that's ever been written. She goes weeping away, and he goes, I am not going to let you get away. I'm going after you.
I'm not leaving this room until we settle this.
Exactly. I mean, and like every woman listening to this, when you said that, went, oh, like that's because it says, I love you. I care about you, right? Like those are those things that make you feel that way. Well, okay, that's a character in a novel. That's usually fiction. And
usually written by a woman.
And probably written by a woman, because the actual real guys out there, the neuroscience of the male brain is such that in most cases, not all, but in most cases, when you pull away in the middle of an argument and you're secretly hoping he's going to come after you, but you're pulling away, he's going, oh, thank goodness, because I just need to get alone and think, right? Like I need to figure out what I'm thinking. Okay, this will be good. We'll go to our separate corners. We'll think about it and we'll come back together.
Or if you're like me, it'll just blow over.
It'll just blow over. And you're over there as the wife going, why isn't he coming after me? Why isn't he pursuing me? And if that is your expectation and he goes, oh, thank goodness, not that you would hear him think that, but he's going, oh, thank goodness, and he's going to his corner to process instead, it is highly likely that you may be unhappy. Instead of going, and here's the key, it's got to come full circle. It's not just sort of going, okay, maybe that expectation is something that he's just not wired to do, or she's just not wired to do, or whatever. You also then have to go, but what are they good at? What can they do that I can celebrate? That's the fantasy that I can expect, and actually something they will delight in meeting.
Yeah, and that becomes a factual fantasy.
There you go.
But when we get married, I'm finding that for me, I know it seems like all marriage, especially the first couple years, is just unpacking these fantasies that you never really knew you had, that you don't end up questioning the fantasy, you question your spouse. Yes. I know for Jen, if she were on right now, she would say, yeah, because she grew up with her dad as a general contractor. I mean, every home she lived in 27 homes as she was growing up in one zip code. Okay. One zip code, 27 homes, all built by hand by her dad, who could do all of it if he wanted to. Now, he had subcontractors, but he knew how it all get done, and it was all done perfectly.
Wow.
Like Mr. Straight, it lives up to his name. It is straight construction. It is done a certain way, the straight way. And so naturally, when we get married and we walk into our first house, which was like just this beater of a house, had literally a tree growing through the back door, back part of the house. It was a Roach Motel in Dallas, Texas. And we walk in, and Jen had never seen the house. And I remember something happened. She's like, hey, Brian, the door's broken. It's not lining up right. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And she's going, well, aren't you going to fix it? I'm like, I have no idea how to fix that, and something would break down. And there was a sadness that started coming in where she started to realize that she didn't know that was a fantasy.
Yeah.
It's a fantasy because her husband can't do that. And if it can't be fixed with a screwdriver or a hammer, I'm pretty much out of luck. I grew up with a dad that when something broke in the house, he called somebody who would fix it.
Yeah.
And so those two things came together, and man, that was a struggle, and it has been. And fortunately, I've grown a little bit, but I'm never going to be her dad. That just wasn't my background.
Yep. And let me just tell you, sometimes the factual fantasies can work in the reverse order. Like sometimes it's you being kind to yourself, and saying, it's okay that I'm never going to be her dad, right? Like my fantasy might have been that I was the perfect handyman, and that's just not me. It's like I can work, I can play, I can learn, I can grow, but there are just things that we are just not ever going to really feel come naturally.
Yeah. We were talking to Bruce, our podcast producer, about this, that he realized real quick one of his fantasies or thoughts that wasn't going to come true. You realized early on, oh, wow, my wife isn't exactly how I thought it was going to be.
Yeah. So we weren't even married yet. I was proposing to her. Beautiful landscape. I mean, this was like movies are shot here. It's Norman Ridge in Vermontville. And I'm down on one knee. I've got her favorite flowers. It's a beautiful day out. I ask her to marry me. I'll give you my life. I'm giving you my life. Will you give me yours?
Right.
And she says yes, of course. Well, not of course, but she says yes.
Of course, it's Bruce.
Obviously. No, she says yes, and she's excited. but she didn't cry or anything. And she's an emotional person. She didn't cry. Fast forward a couple months, we have our registry. She has a particular expensive blender that she's dreamed of on the registry. And I get a phone call and she's tearing up and she says, "You won't believe it, but someone got the blender off our registry." So that made her cry. But me asking her to, become my wife, she was happy, but not happy enough to cry.
Not wired enough to cry at a proposal, but you get a great brand new Vitamix or something.
Yeah.
It's time to get out the Kleenex.
Yeah, I didn't expect that.
Didn't expect that.
And that's an expectation. Like, I should always be able to make my wife so happy.
Yes.
That she will show that emotion. Like, that's going to be my thing. And like, it doesn't always work that way. And so,
I was going to say, Bruce, why didn't you bring a blender to your proposal? That's what you should have done. Forget the flowers. Like, bring the blender.
Now I know.
Next time.
Yeah. When you do the rededication, the vow renewal for Weekend to Remember, bring the blender.
So what about you, Shaunti? Has there been expectations that we've talked about the messiness and all that kind of stuff, but anything else?
Yeah, I think probably there's one of the big ones is actually something that I think a lot of couples wrestle with to some degree or another. At least it seems that way in our research, which is, it's interesting. Jeff is an attorney, and there was this, I guess, this subconscious, because a lot of these expectations are subconscious, I guess the subconscious expectation that we would never really wrestle with money, right? Like when I was working on Wall Street, Jeff was working on a big New York law firm. We were all making $1 bazillion and for a period of time. And then God calls us into this family ministry. And suddenly, like, things can be hard. Like, for example, during the pandemic, all of our events went away.
Right.
Hey,
you didn't see that coming.
I didn't see that coming. Our income dropped 86% in 1 year. And so that's an example of when money times would get tight. That was like, oh my gosh, I realized one of the reasons that I'm unhappy is that there was something in me that had been thinking, well, Jeff will just take care of that. I won't ever have that problem because he'll have this big time lawyer job. And that just wasn't what God called us to. So that was like, for us, that was something I had to wrestle with. And I think it's something that a lot of people,
I think a lot of us look at our spouse in such a way that they'll be in a certain tax bracket, or they'll have a certain standard of living maybe that they grew up with, that when they got married, they didn't realize, being a missionary may not have that same experience. Like, we may not get the new car every 2 years that some people grew up with, right?
Well, like, for example, my daughter, she graduated from Georgia Tech. She's an engineer, right? Like, she worked her tail off and she is an engineer. And guess what? She's probably going to be making a pretty good salary. Well, the young man that she's been dating for 3 years, who knows? They might end up getting married. Okay. He wants to be a history teacher to middle schoolers.
Perfect.
And you know what? She will probably always make more money than he does. And so her expectation of, I'd love to be a stay-at-home mom. Well, maybe, but it may not look like on a different salary.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, but at least they could have summers going out and having fun.
Exactly.
That's right. Bruce, anything else for you? I mean, I know that you had that expectation for Maria. Has she have anything for you?
Yeah, well, a year and a half after the proposal, we're on our way to our 1 year anniversary. We had booked a cruise. I don't want to take too much credit. I had booked the cruise.
Nice.
So we're driving there, and somehow it came up, and it was discovered that she has a card for me, but I don't have a card for her. And a fight ensued, because in my mind, I was like, the cruise is your card.
The cruise is a card.
But she wanted a card as well.
Yeah.
So she had that expectation, and she got a nice, note written on the little memo pad from our room.
It's beautiful. It's much more authentic.
Well, and I texted her to make sure it was okay to share that story, and I told her, because we want to use it as an example of unmet expectations, and she replied with very standard and reasonable expectations.
I know. And Jen would be here right now snapping her fingers going, absolutely right. Because the same thing when we go on the Love Like You Mean It cruise here with Family Life, it always goes over Valentine's Day. And I always ask the guys, like, how many of you came on this thinking this was your Valentine's Day gift and you were done? You didn't have to rush to Walgreens and get the card at the last hour, the ninth inning, and get some candy or something. And they're all like, yeah, that seems right.
The cruise is the card.
The cruise is the card. And then you find out, no, it's not the card. There needs to be a card. But no one said that when we got married. I know for me, when I got married, I honestly thought the sex shop was going to be open 24/7. That was an expectation. No one told me differently. No one explained to me that sometimes, it wasn't open 24/7. It's more like bank, like an old time bank, brick and mortar bank, where it's like the shop closes down a lot sooner than you think. There's unexpected holidays. Sometimes the bank teller has a headache, all that kind of stuff. And we tend to, as we've talked about, with this one, is that we got to move into that factual fantasy. It's not that these expectations aren't maybe even realistic, right? Yeah. They just aren't according to the wiring of the person,
your spouse,
of your specific spouse. And what we end up doing is that we don't question if the expectation is right or realistic or according to their wiring. We question our spouse. Yep. Why don't if they would do this if they love me, they would buy the card if they love me,
right? As opposed to, okay, there are things we can learn.
Yeah.
And by the way, can we just say out loud, it's important to say there are things that we can learn. We can develop. And, a lot of these secrets that we've been talking about in this season are things that are habits that need to be built. And they may not always come naturally, but we can build them. So don't hear us saying, as you're listening to this, that, just because it's not their natural wiring to buy you a card,
right,
that you shouldn't hope that at some point you make it clear that that means something to you. And he'll kind of get that over time. I mean, it may or may not, but it's okay to sort of say, this is something that would matter to me. That is totally fine. The key is don't make it an expectation that then when it is not met, you are going to be just so distressed and so sad and unhappy about something when you could be focusing on something that they can do. I mean, how awesome was it that Bruce booked a cruise for the first anniversary? He was thinking about it and I'm quite sure that his wife, I'm sure looked at that and went, oh my gosh, this is incredible, right? And that she did have that sense of gratitude. But that's the kind of thing that we often just don't do unless we purposely go, all right, what is it here that my spouse is wired for that I can be excited about?
And where do a lot of these expectations come from anyway? It's like, again, we don't question the expectation, we question our spouse.
Yeah. Well, where the stuff comes from, I mean, like I mentioned, the media, right? That's one example. We don't even realize how much of that may come from the media. And not to put too fine a point on it, but if I can just be really honest to any men listening out there who are thinking the sex shop is going to be open 24/7, I hate to say this out loud, but a lot of those expectations come from pornography and come from locker room conversations at the age of 15 when there's literally no relevance to anything about normal human women.
Well, and I would say too, and it behooves us to say, we, both sides, whether you're men or women, have sexpectations. We call them sexpectations.
That's true.
And we haven't learned how to have conversations about sex. So we just fill up all these unmet, unspoken expectations. And for some women that are listening, they're going, I wish my husband thought that the sex shop was open 24/7, right?
Right.
So we know that it happens on both sides, but we got to stop and go, okay, where am I getting that expectation? Is it right? Is it realistic? Yes. Is it according to my spouse?
And can we talk about it? I mean, that's the reason we did the whole season on Secrets of Sex and Marriage last season, which I would totally encourage anyone who has these expectations and is like, what does this look like? Go listen to that season because it goes into all of these areas that we can actually learn how we are wired and how our spouse is wired if we will just communicate.
Yeah.
So another thing I do think we need to acknowledge about where the expectations come from, it's not just media, obviously. We grew up with a certain family, a certain pattern that we saw, a certain, lifestyle or culture. And all of those things baked their way into our minds and our hearts, and we don't even realize. Like Jen growing up with a dad who is a fantastic general contractor and could, fix anything. She didn't even know that was baked in.
And it was, and it's not it's not like it's a wrong expectation.
No.
It's just, it didn't fit her. It didn't fit her husband. One of the things that I hope happens with Married with Benefits is that you guys end up engaging in great conversations. That's one of the reasons why I love Weekend to Remember with FamilyLife. It's a 3-day experience where couples come together and have the conversations they most need to have, but probably aren't having for whatever reason. In fact, we got a letter from a lady that went to the Weekend to Remember in Destin, Florida. Good place to go, by the way. And she said this about it. She said, it created the pause and became the catalyst for us to have the conversations we have swept under the rug because we have been too busy or didn't want to rock the boat. 10 years later, the rug is full and we keep tripping over it. I'm thankful for this time and look forward to revisiting and working through our marriage goals from home together. That's what we're all about here at Family Life, helping you have the conversations that matter most, whether it's listening to this podcast or going to something like a Weekend to Remember. You can find a great spot to go to at any one of our 80 locations if you look up weekendtoremember.com, or we have the link in our show notes. All right, back to more great conversations here on Married with Benefits. We're unwrapping that gift that God has given us, and there's some things that we didn't expect that would come. And there's things that we hoped that would be in that gift that weren't there. But we just don't often realize that. And there's a variety of things that happen in a married life that end up changing those expectations, right?
Sure.
We discover their spouse's strengths and weaknesses. Maybe there's some age or health issue. Kids come into play, and that totally changes what expectations are going to have for your spouse, right? And so I think that I like what you say in the book, that there comes a point in time where it's almost like you got to grow up a little bit in your marriage and the way that you love your spouse.
It's more so. I don't want to give the wrong impression, but it is about living in reality. Yeah. Like there is a need to look at your spouse with clear eyes and say, you know what? For example, I can't tell you the number of men privately who have told me, I always thought that my wife would just be this amazing cook. Right. And that she would just love being in the kitchen, and that, my main problem would be not gaining weight because she was, and I would always want to have people over to my house because she'd be this incredible hostess. And okay, but you now have been married for a year or two, and it's very clear that you guys trade off cooking, and neither of you is ever going to be unless one of you goes to a chef school or something, culinary arts school. And Chef Boyardee is your chef, right? That's
sad. That's so sad right now. I would be unhappy if Chef Boyardee was what we came home to.
But see, that's an example, right? And I can't tell you the number of women I've talked to who are in this, I can learn, but it's not my greatest joy. And so how would you feel about a HelloFresh subscription?
Yeah.
Right? We shouldn't have to. Well, who are you married to? Right. And it's just, again, it is, what's the reality?
Yeah. If we're constant, how do I know if I'm not accepting or if I'm not really pursuing factual fantasies? That's a great line. My spouse should.
Yep.
They should. If we're using the word should in our own narrative in our head, then chances are you're going to be unhappy.
There, exactly.
Right?
That's the signal. And then the shift is not just, okay, live in reality.
Yeah.
The shift is, okay, what am I celebrating in that reality? What am I looking for? What am I getting excited about?
Yeah.
Because we don't want to get the impression that this is, are you telling me to lower my expectations?
Good.
No, this is not about lowering. This is about actually looking at who your spouse is and being excited about that.
Right.
And so one of the examples, going back to that story of the money and me and Jeff, right? So here we are dealing with all these, money issues. And, at the time when that first started, we had young kids and there was all this stuff going on. And Jeff decided that, I should probably go back to the law firm, and because it was hard. And I'm like, no. And I was so upset that he would think about going back to a law firm. Why? Because I had started to see that, wow, he is such an amazing dad. And wow, what a huge blessing that our kids have, that they have both of us, and that he can actually get them from school a lot of times. Like if I'm out speaking at a women's event, He's the one who's picking them up from school. Like, how many kids would love to have that time with their dad? So I started being so excited about that when he said, you know what, I need to go back to the law firm and, I'm like, no, because the kids would then never see him. He'd be working 60-hour weeks. And so that's an example of it has to come full circle. It's not just sort of recognizing the reality, it's celebrating it.
Yeah, that's really, really good. I like what you said in the book. You said giving up your expectations and your rights usually results in getting back the love you wanted all along.
Very true. Yeah, I had mentioned in an earlier episode about the 30-day kindness challenge where everybody's like doing something every day for 30 days. And that 66% of people said that at the end of it, they felt more loved and appreciated, even though they were the ones doing all the work.
Yeah.
That 66 is not 100%.
Right.
But it is very common. Just the way God works.
That's so good. And it is about accepting the reality you're in and the spouse that you have. And let's be clear, that's going to change as the years go on. Or it could change when you're least expecting it, and you have to adjust your expectations. There's parents that end up having a child that is born with a special need, where all of a sudden now you have to adjust your expectations and adjust the reality you're in, or you'll be perpetually disappointed.
Yeah.
I think about my buddy Greg. We tell his story. He's a mentor of mine. We tell it in the New Art of Marriage, session 1. It's a 6-session video series. Great to go through with small group.
Everybody needs to go through it with a small group.
You guys are in it in the session on intimacy, you and Dr. Seitzma. And so this story, I love it because it tells the story of what does faithfulness really look like. And 5 years into Greg's marriage, she had grown up doing gymnastics. He was passionate about being a pastor back in his own small farming community. And so they had this dream, this vision, expectation, right, good, and godly, that they would go back to their hometown. He would minister to farmers. She would teach gymnastics. But they went to the doctor because she was having trouble with her eyesight, seeing double vision, and she was struggling a little bit with some of her joints and found out she has MS. 5 years into their marriage, not 25, 30, 40 years, 5 years. And they end up having 4 kids. So, they had 2 at the time, and they had 2 more came on. And when you're pregnant, some of those MS, symptoms dissipate.
Yep.
And so they thought she was healed. It came back in full force, and she became bedridden for 20 years of their married life.
Wow.
And so, but yet Greg at my office, I remember I worked with him for a year and a half. I go, we'd all go out to lunch, and I go, Greg, you want to come with us? I get to go have lunch with my wife, and he was smiling. Like Greg always, I get to.
Yep.
I get to go home and have lunch. He adjusted his reality, and their marriage, I'm tearing up just thinking about it, is an example to me of like, man, how do you adjust your perspective so that you can learn to go, I'm going to be happy with the fantasy, the factual fantasy that God has given me right now.
Yeah.
So that wasn't easy. He's a sinful guy just like the rest of us. He had expectations, and he would have loved to have taken, go on walks at night with his wife. But instead it was, they would sit in the bedroom. They'd talk about, what she had listened to on the radio that day and how she had prayed for people that had come over to the house or whatever it might be. They found different ways to celebrate. Like you said, celebrate the reality you're in.
Yeah.
Celebrate the spouse that you've had. So let's think about, how do I move from those unmet expectations, which causes so much unhappiness, whether it's about money or conflict or what I wish my spouse would do for me, to then how do we make those little steps to create the factual fantasies?
I love we've identified a couple of factors, okay? But the first thing that you have to do is to eliminate this concept of, if my spouse loved me, they would, with a blank, and you fill in the blank with something they're not wired for. If my spouse loved me, they would be making a ton of money.
Yeah.
If my spouse loved me, they would always pursue me when I'm upset, instead of going to their corner to process.
They would look a certain way.
They would look, if my spouse loved me, they would go to the gym every day because they know that that's important to me. Those things, there's nothing wrong with having some, hopes and dreams and visions. And certainly there are things that it's fine to expect. It's fine to expect that, I think, that your spouse, it contributes financially, right? Like there's certain things that
to be healthy. Yeah.
It's fine to expect that your husband is going to say, I love you to you, right? Like those are fine. But so often we're filling in that blank with stuff that's way beyond that they're just not they're not wired for. If my spouse loved me, they would have sex every day, right?
Yeah.
Like those kinds of things. And so let's identify sort of the two factors that I think can get us beyond this. The first is to sort of say, is there anything about my spouse that I am expecting that is just not realistic to expect over time, right? Like they're just not wired for. I would suggest that somebody write down maybe 3, 4, 5, like what are those things? Because again, like Jen didn't even know she had the expectation about the handyman.
Right.
If you've been married for a length of time, you may have some ideas by now. What are
I
those
know
things
one. I would write down right now. I'd write down that I would expect my wife to be a mind reader.
Oh, there you go.
It's amazing
Absolutely.
how many times I'm sitting in bed, and it's funny. It tends to be, I don't know, not always about sex. It's really not always about sex, but it is funny how many times that I think if Jen loved me right now, she would know that I'm probably wanting it.
If she loved me,
or she like, can't she see any of these signals that I'm dropping, even as obscure as they might be? But I expect her to be a mind reader, or that she would have noticed that I did something, around the house, and it's like, and I expect her so often just to read what I'm thinking.
Yep. Okay. So then what you have to do, the second sort of way of handling that is you have to then go full circle.
Right.
And you have to then say, okay, wait, no, not just here's the things I'm expecting that may not be what they're wired for, but then also what are they wired for?
Right.
What are some of the things that they are able to and do for you that you can go, oh my gosh, that's awesome. I can totally expect that, and then celebrate it because now that is meeting an expectation I just kind of took for granted before or whatever it is. So I think that that's a good start for changing your mind.
That's really, really good. So to build a factual fantasy, I'm eliminating that idea. If my spouse loved me, they would do X. Fill in that blank that we know they're not wired for. We know we've lived with them long enough. You know what they're wired for, what they're not wired for. Then start doing an inventory. Take some time, really write down what is it that I often expect out of my spouse that's just not realistic. It's not right.
Yes.
And then what are the things they can do? Celebrate those things and maybe even mention those in a cool, creative way.
Yeah.
But then I think this is a really good one. This last part, these expectations, often the reason why we're unhappy is that we're not really speaking them. They just go unspoken. They're unmet because they're unspoken.
Right, exactly. They're down deep somewhere inside, and we haven't actually made it clear. Because again, if they love me, they should just know.
And one of the ways that this really, I learned this lesson early on with Jen, is that we would always have conflict about Saturdays. We would have conflict because I would wake up and I would start doing what I wanted to do. I'd go work in the yard. I'd take care of the garage. I would, I had a list of things, and then I would watch college football, and preferably with a sandwich and a bag of chips. And I noticed that, and then take a nap. If things are great, I'd take a nap. And I noticed that Jen would get frustrated, and she would often be vacuuming like right around me when I'm watching football and stomping around a little. I'm like, what is the deal? And she's like, well, you just went off and started doing stuff. You didn't even talk to me. I'm like, what do you mean? It's Saturday. And that's because I had brought into this, like, this is what I did on Saturdays. That's how I live my single life. And I was perfectly happy. And we just did Saturdays differently.
Yeah. And she was expecting that her husband would be present, would be asking about her week.
And cleaning.
And cleaning and helping her. Exactly.
Right? And naps aren't for Saturday, they're for Sunday. So all this stuff. And for us, one of the best things that we learned to do is on a Friday night or Saturday morning, we started asking each other the question, so what would make it a win for you today?
That's a great question.
And it's like we're just getting out the expectations. Same thing could happen with vacations. There's a lot of people that have conflict over vacations because
is a vacation to relax where you don't do anything, or is a vacation one that you come back from so busy that you kind of need a vacation?
Exactly. You need a vacation from your vacation.
Exactly.
And so I think it's best just to get that out in the open. And so we've had a lot more fun now going, because it gives us a chance to go, okay, I want to meet that need. And for her to go, oh, I want to meet that need for you, or I want to fill that expectation. I think one of the best examples of that, and I'll close with this, is this story that's in your book. I think it's one of my favorite ones. I read it again this morning. And this very practical wife, she put it this way: why should I be upset when I didn't get what I wanted for my birthday when I didn't tell him? It's kind of going back to that Valentine's Day card. Like, okay, I'm expecting this card even though we're going on this great cruise. He would always get me cards and roses. He thought I liked that. So finally I told him, I don't like cards. I don't like roses, but I do like plants. I can plant in my garden that I can look back and think, he got me that this year or that year. And so every year he gets me a plant and I have a whole garden full of memories.
I love that.
I just love that line. And it's funny how we can go months, years being so frustrated at our spouse, but really just look in the mirror and go, have you even spoken about that? Have you said you have that desire, you have that need? I mean, God put us together so that we wouldn't be lonely. And I find that we're so often so lonely because we just aren't willing to speak up.
Yep. And be okay with revising your expectation that
So
you shouldn't
good.
have to.
Yep, that's good. Well, that secret's a great one, developing, it sounds crazy, factual fantasies. When we start doing that together, what you'll expect to find is that you'll actually enjoy your marriage a lot more. Thanks for joining us for this episode. If you enjoy this podcast, please hit like or subscribe. And please leave a review or a comment. It just helps get the word out to more couples so that they could find hope for their own marriage. And listen, if you haven't picked up Shaunti's book that we're talking about all this season long, The Surprising Secrets of Highly Happy Marriages, you're going to want to get that and maybe grab one to give away, because that's really what we're about here at Family Life. We want to help you experience oneness so that you could impact your corner of the world. And listen, we've got a lot more help and hope for your marriage and family at FamilyLife.com. You can find other articles, you can find podcasts, you can find shows, small group resources. You'll want to check that out at FamilyLife.com.